First and foremost, there's already been some interesting stuff in regards to news from Capcom and like tournament structure and stuff like that, like how Capcom is structuring their tournaments for Street Fighter V, and this is presumably I feel like the reason this is here is so that they can establish this, right? The whole reason there's this weird fiasco of like tournament guidelines and sort of like third-party management of their product is to establish a sort of like rule set, if not moving forward progression of how things will be managed and handled by Capcom for their properties in regards to tournaments, you know? Because long story short, there's a new Capcom fighting game around the horizon. We don't know exactly when it comes out, but if they lay down the groundwork of this stuff, then this makes a lot of sense why they're sort of setting these guidelines and specific rules. Is this in prep for Street Fighter 6? I'm saying yes. I'm saying that yes, this is, in my opinion, this makes a lot of sense that this is being announced now in comparison to when because Street Fighter 6 was announced, and they're essentially establishing the road work of where they are going to be moving in terms of like community brand management and esports and community esports and stuff like that. And it didn't go well. So long story short, let's look at Exhibit A. Capcom yesterday announced this, that they're calling all tournament organizers to check out their new community licensing agreement for running events in Street Fighter V CE. It covers everything you need to know about one easy reference space, and oh boy, it is a doozy. Oh man, ooh, I am still scrolling. It's a doozy, going all the way over to proper brand logo management and all that kind of stuff, right? Like a whole bunch of stuff in here. And even if we quickly scroll by, we can talk about like licensing reasons, because yes, you do need to, if you run like tournament events for games, this happened not even that long ago with Bandai Namco, right? Where Bandai Namco was getting on people's cases about either Tekken or Dragon Ball FighterZ, and that you had to have the licensing approval for those games in order to run tournaments with them, or else they can essentially shut it all down. Don't get me wrong, this is absolutely within these companies' ability to do so. It is their game. If people are making events on it, then it is what it is. There's a lot in here to gather, and it's probably not a good idea for us as regular humans to go over stuff like this. So we will consult the guidance of a lawyer, Ultra David, who is a copyright lawyer, has helped me on a variety of things throughout the years. And he is an avid fighting game aficionado and a Street Fighter fan for practically life, right? So he was able to go through this stuff and sort of break down with a professional eye what exactly is going on. And to boil it down, he gave us like a couple of top points that sort of give us an idea of what this even is. So let's go over this one by one, because there's only like 6 or so here that really affect the overall situation. All tournaments, regardless of size, have to get a license from Capcom, either by satisfying and agreeing to the tournament community license or by getting a separate esports license. And to qualify for the community license, a total event prize pool and revenue from sponsors must be under thresholds, and many existing events will likely go over. So there's like different brackets and categories to how big your tournament is or how small it is, and the qualification for each one is a bit different. This is kind of, see, in a way, some things in here already, this seems like this might be bad news, but it actually kind of is good news, because if it's a smaller event, they can just go, okay, yeah, sure. Seemingly, if that happens quickly, if that's a throughput that happens fast, and it's just like, hey, we want to run a Street Fighter V tournament. There's only so many people. It's not going to be that big. Is that fine? That we can actually, like, you know, market it and stuff like that. And Capcom goes, sure, here's our logo. Here's the guidelines. Have fun. Right? And then that kind of makes sense. It could sort of just make that process go fast, but I don't know if it's going to be like that. And that's the weird part about this whole situation. Number 3, organizers can't charge spectator fees or sell merchandise based on Street Fighter V names, logos, and art. So, damn, I already have... Is Artist Alley canceled? Does that mean that Artist Alley is just canceled? Wow. No merch at all. I'm pretty sure it does. No logos, no names, no art. It doesn't say characters, right? It doesn't specifically say that you can't charge spectator fees or sell merchandise based on Street Fighter V names, logos, and art. You know what I think? Actually, this is not Artist Alley. If you read this, it's not Artist Alley. Fan art's fine. You just can't sell things that have the official Street Fighter V logo on them. Or organizers specifically can't like make a Street Fighter V shirt. So this is, if you read this closely, this is very specific, and it says tournament organizers. So fan art and stuff like that is fine. That is absolutely officially fine. This is the weird thing when it comes to all this stuff, is that it all comes across as very aggressive, when a lot of the guys that I've heard from the Capcom side say they're trying to like alleviate some of the processes of getting approval for these tournaments. So they're just like coming up with these sort of guidelines that establish that, and they're like, this will make it quicker. But instead it comes across as something much different. Capcom gets the rights to use stream footage or any photos or videos from the tournament. I think that's completely fair. It's their game, right? It's your game. Yeah. TOs can use an asset pack from Capcom for advertise the event using their style guidelines. Right. Okay. And this only applies to TOs in North America. South America are different. Licensing applies to Europe, Middle East, and Africa applies there as well. Okay. So yeah, and here's the breakdown of how modern day tournaments essentially are run, like whether it's community tournaments or whatnot. In order to run a standard tournament, you make a bunch of copies of a game available to play and watch, which implicates the public performance. You set up a big screen where people can watch and marquee matches. You broadcast the stream, upload VODs, and it can have overlays and commentators, yada yada yada. I'm skimming over some of the backstories behind these examples for the sake of brevity, and suffice to say that if the copyright owner in any video game wants to shut down a tournament, they don't lack the ways to do it. We were just saying that. Basically, video game rights holders are the rulers of their little copyright fiefdoms. That's a new word for me. And the rest of us who want to play and work with their borders have little choice but to abide their rules. They're absolutely right. Like at any point, if I'm streaming any kind of game of any kind, and somebody doesn't like me streaming that game of any kind, they can take me down, and I don't really have much to say about it, right? Like objectively, there's more of like a general blanket of like okayness from a lot of these companies in regards to this stuff. The really crazy part that I think a lot of people are getting upset about is the community event stuff. So for individual events, if there's a prize pool smaller than $2 grand and a sponsorship revenue less than 5,000, so that's what constitutes a community event. So $2,000 prize pool. So if it was like, what is that, $20 per person, and if you had like 100 entrants, right, that would essentially be over. Or just about over, right? For any TO in the 12-month period, have a total prize pool less than $10,000 and total sponsorships revenues less than $20,000. Okay, so if there's weeklies that get decent amounts of people that show up, even if you have like, you know, 30 people every single week, those prize pools are definitely going to equal over $10,000, right? Most likely, depending on what your entry fee is. So if the prize pool announced in advance what the pool is, or at least to say how it will be calculated, don't sell merchandise, as the same before, don't charge fee to spectators to participate, which is a little ambiguous. What does this apply to? For an individual event, the $2,000 prize pool restriction comes up with any tournament with 200 plus entrants at $10 a fee. A breakdown of like how this is different between smaller events like CEO and Combo Breaker, and they surely have at least that many. And whenever the next Evo happens, they will have many more. Pre-COVID events like Frosty and all these exceed or got close to that threshold. I suspect that all those events likely ran afoul to the $5,000 sponsorship limitation. Yeah, so you can't have sponsorship revenue that gets more than that. I'm curious what Capcom takes as a result of it, right? For TOs running multiple events, Winter Brawl and all of these, where they don't meet the $2,000 limit for one event, they may meet the $10,000 prize pool limit or $20,000 sponsorship limit. These yearly requirements may also be a problem for popular weeklies, which we just talked about, like NLBC. But then that's true. You got things like Matcherino, sponsorship revenue, prize pool money. And in addition, just about every major and local have spectator fees in some form. If I'm right, I'm reading that Capcom's rules ban spectator fees in general, and not many events in our community would be considered community events. Wow. So this is specifically just the community stuff, right? And then you actually get into the esports side of stuff. What will licenses look like? This is like getting in a situation where you're abiding by all these guidelines, right? And then you actually get to the big esports stuff. Even he doesn't know. He hasn't seen any recent licensing agreements between Capcom or any events to consider to be esports. Yeah, like, I'm thinking outside of Japan. What big esports initiative does Capcom have an association with? And I don't know. I don't know why they would go get like an esports license from Capcom or what that would even qualify. I'm starting to think what the heck that is. Maybe Evo? But Evo's technically community run. But I would imagine not anymore because it is Red Bull Kumite, good call. Because it is now run by Sony. So that might be a different situation. That could be a different situation now because it's not technically community run. It's totally possible that Capcom has different licenses in mind for different events. Nothing in this law or the community license agreement says that Capcom has to treat all esports events the same. Maybe an event that is just barely too big a prize pot to the community gets an even relatively laid-back license that doesn't make sense for major demands. Maybe 2 or 3 large events get a license that costs them a huge amount of money. And I can't see for sure, of course. It's a common way of handling these things. Let me see David's take on why would they do this? One of the goals may be to protect their rights, which Capcom has been getting a bit aggressive with over the past couple years. Copyrights don't disappear if you defend them, but there are some situations where rights holders can lose some rights or have their rights weakened to avoid those outcomes. Disney's like the perfect example of this, where they like viceroy their rights. It's a common legal practice to make clear that you're being active in those who get to make what uses with your copyright works. In that case, requiring every TO to get a license makes it very clear that Capcom is being proactive with its rights. And once again, this lines up with about a year ago where Capcom had a big, like, not the Capcom Ambassador program, but like a proper like brand sort of like character licensing and rights agreement, right? That if you like stream Capcom games, you're essentially agreeing to like these licensing rights and stuff like that. I don't know if you guys remember that from about a year ago. Yeah, like the essential no hentai, like stop making porn about our characters sort of thing that it seemed to be. In addition, bringing every TO into its orbit may allow Capcom to exercise additional control, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the community license requires TOs to enforce a code of conduct. In fact, hang on a second. Prohibited behavior, excessive swearing and screaming, harassment or intimidation of any player, okay. Physical or cyber violence, okay. Collusion, all right. Cheating or any sort through any means, okay. Interference with any infrastructure for the event, including gaming equipment or hardware, okay. Intentionally delaying or slowing and manipulating gameplay. So... intentionally disconnecting network cables, okay. Intentionally interrupting network connectivity, okay. Disobeying or showing noticeable or disruptive dissent at the reasonable instructions or request. Oh, you don't agree with the rules? Fuck off. Okay. Players will adhere to all health and safety protocols, right? And all other known... So the one that comes off weird to me is... This is broad, right? Threats, obviously, right? Swearing... Obviously, in some situations, you just do not want to have people cursing, right? You want to be a family-friendly Street Fighter brand, but like these put together are very broad. Here's a situation that might or might not be bannable. If the crowd screams, it's over. The crowd screams? No, that's not okay. If I just put my arcade stick down and I leaned this way and I had just one top 8 and I go, ah! I do not win the prize pool and I'm out. Excessive swearing. Maybe you could scream once, maybe once, but the second time is considered excessive. Crowd gets a sticker. Here's the weird thing about all this like micromanagement is that a lot of it comes across as like, wait, like all these little things that collide and you don't know exactly what's possibly okay at tournaments anymore. While a lot of these other things are obviously fine, right? Like almost any of these other things outside of intentionally delaying or slowing this is like, if you time out, you're gonna get banned, dude. Justin Wong would not have made it through the mid-2000s if that was the case. Like, I'm almost kind of curious. This is a very real weird thing. And with a lot, yeah, this is like almost, to me it seems like no turtling. What? Intentionally, right? Yeah, you're intentionally timer scamming, right? If that's like the way you win, huh? It just means lag switch. Oh, this is related to online. Gotcha. Capcom's within its rights to do this. He's totally right. Esports games like Blizzard and Riot have similar licensing structure for years. How do they handle the terms of what counts as a community event? And Blizzard has the exact same thing. They seem to be doing very similar but comparable things to companies like Blizzard, if not Riot. I'm wary of video game rights holders taking on too much power for the communities and industries that sprung up around their games. My take on the history of esports is that it's been full of passionate communities who do the work to create an industry and then gets co-opted by rights holders once it's economically valuable. If that's what's going on here, I'm against it. Here's my personal take on this situation, and this is more of a broad take, right? Like, this isn't just talking about the esports side of Capcom and how the Capcom esports brand has developed over the years, much less where community events are now, like all that kind of stuff. Here's my personal take on all this like insane micromanagement. From a spectator side, right? From somebody that does not actively look upon Street Fighter as being a competitive game that I have given an absolute two shits about for a very long time. I like to watch it every once in a while, essentially like once a year. But I mostly watch competitive tournaments and events for games that I'm actively playing, right? I actually like watching events and tournaments for games that I play like all the time or really want to get better at. So that has not happened to me with Street Fighter V since 2016. It's been a very long time, so I have not just followed up on it. However, it has been pretty obvious that the state of like viewership and overall Capcom esports brand awareness in general is only so big. It's not nearly as big as what it was with like Ultra Street Fighter 4, so it's already been like compromised in several ways because Street Fighter V was a game that severely damaged the Street Fighter brand in terms of its casual approach and audience. Because a lot of people would tune into tournaments for older Street Fighter games like Street Fighter 4 because they were similar to me. They just want to see people do really good so they can copy the really good stuff, if not try to emulate it. And it's fun to watch people compete in the game that you like the most. All I have to say is that it's really weird to start micromanaging all these smaller tournaments and events when it already doesn't feel like there's a ton of them anyway. It doesn't really feel like Street Fighter V is such a widely recognized, like, insane community / esports brand. It feels like it's mostly controlled in like the Capcom Fighters esports thing, which are already abiding to all of this stuff, right? Because it's their own thing. And it feels like it's weirdly trying to micromanage all these other folks that want to do something small and on the side if they just are passionate and want to build small communities or scenes or something like that, right? There's a weird anime convention in the middle of Albuquerque. I don't know, I'm making this shit up. And someone wants to host like a really quick Street Fighter event and they want to advertise the Street Fighter tournament at their event. Technically, you know, Capcom is within their rights to shut anything down. But now it makes this seem like you have to. Like, if you don't do this, we will shut you down type of thing. And it seems aggressive. I'll actually quote High Fight from this. And he had like a great perspective that I really agreed with in the way this approach felt. And it's like, I get what they're doing. They're trying to make things easier, but it comes across as something much different. Biggest problem with the guidelines is that it screams, if you do not follow this, do not run the tournament. Instead of, we want to encourage community tournaments, here is how you do it. And this is it. That's why it doesn't sound like this would make running an event easier. If anything, this makes it feel like it's harder. It makes it feel like it is a pushback from Capcom. Almost like, okay, there are way too many fucking people running way too many tournaments, right? There's way too much stuff going on, and it's getting out of control. There was a strip club live stream last night where they were doing drugs and having sex. It looked like a great time. But they had a Street Fighter tournament and they were broadcasting the Street Fighter tournament. What the guys? The town meeting, Capcom. We got to do something about this. I watched a live stream last night where they were stripping and having sex and doing drugs. We got to make some guidelines. This is crazy. But it's not. That's not the case. Like, there's really not like a ton of insane Street Fighter events for me to feel like that this should be this way. However, there's a good reason why this is probably happening now. And it's because Street Fighter 6 is on the horizon, that there is a future where they are setting up for these guidelines to already be in place, and they're going to try to figure out what they are and how they are going to manage that with a much bigger game potentially. Routing back, here's my big problem. Capcom fighting games in general have not escaped the past 10 years stigma that has absolutely littered any Capcom fighting game franchise since. It has gotten close with the end of Street Fighter V, right? We've sort of gotten there, but the public perception, right? The perception of people about Capcom fighting games isn't that they're this glorious, like super high up on this pedestal sort of thing, right? Where it's like, man, that final season of Street Fighter V really did it for me, brought a ton of people in, made the community bigger than it ever was. No, all it did was just make the established Street Fighter players happy, right? It just made people happy that, oh man, this finally feels like a season that people fucking want. So that's cool, but they have not escaped this like weird stigma that even with Street Fighter 6's announcement, which isn't a bad announcement by any means, like a lot of people are immediately insanely aggressive and against it, and that they have very good reason to be. Over the past 10 years, every single release of Capcom that is a fighting game, I'm not talking about not fighting games, Capcom on the opposite fighting game division is doing beautifully well, right? Beautifully well. And it feels amazing to be a Capcom fan right now over the past 5 years, right? 5-6 years. But ever since Street Fighter Cross Tekken, and for a little bit Ultimate Marvel 3, every single Capcom fighting game release has given its player base, if not fan base, if not casual audience, reasons to make them speculative of whether or not this is a good thing or am I going to get ripped off. Cross Tekken had the DLC thing. Street Fighter V had a complete different set of problems that happened when it came out that made people really mad and offered like no content. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite came out, fixed problems that Street Fighter V had, but then had a whole new brevity of problems that pissed people off completely. And now we're at a point where finally there's another Capcom fighting game half a decade later, and we're getting an announcement for it, and guess what? People are like, I wish I was excited about this, but I don't know. And I don't blame people for that. So it's weird for me that they're trying to like choke their community out in some way when it's literally like all you have, right? Like, why do you care if some small tournament in the middle of Albuquerque is running a Street Fighter event or a Street Fighter 4 event? Because it's literally like, it's all you have at this point. Because they have not escaped that stigma that has surrounded them. People still make fun of Capcom fighting games as being like the crapcom element. It is not escaped yet. I really disagree with this, right? And don't get me wrong, I get blamed and accused for being the biggest Capcom fanboy and apologist of all time, but also being a huge Street Fighter hater, because I don't see Street Fighter V in like a black or white, like Street Fighter V bad or Marvel Infinite good. Like I see things with a gray area in between where like some parts of Street Fighter V are actually super sick, but a lot of it is not, man. And I feel like the exact same way about Marvel Infinite, but those things that are in that gray area is a huge point of contention for the community, if not the casual fan base. I don't feel like Capcom fighting games as a brand is in a spot enough to be really picky. If that's, maybe it's just me. It feels like maybe a whole bunch of other fighting games are able to be, like Smash, for example, and the way they were acting last week, they can essentially act however the hell they want because their games are doing so good and there's so many characters and 30 million copies sold or some crazy shit. But to me, it does not feel like they should be stepping in and micromanaging and all this stuff. Like they are a giant esports brand in the same vein as like Valorant or League. Like I don't get it. Like I genuinely don't get it. So they released this statement, which followed up because everybody was pissed. Like, I do see the sides in between where they're like, we want to use this to allow you to run things easier. I see that some places, but then you keep reading and it's like, what? Like, we can't do like it feels like instead of allowing smaller events to exist, especially people that don't have giant esports money, it feels like they want to shut those things down. Yesterday, they published a new Street Fighter V community license agreement, yada yada. Our aim was to make running an event easier. When TOs have contacted Capcom about running events in the past, the approval process has taken a lot of time. We want to make the rules clear and allow for much faster approvals. We've also been keen to build tighter relationships with TOs and encourage safe spaces to play the game. Thank you for everyone who has sent us feedback this far on a new agreement. We're reviewing the feedback with a wider Capcom team to follow up with more updates soon. Well, good. I hope it changes, because if there's one thing, and I'm being super real here, if there's one thing I could want more than anything right now, this has been the case for, I'm not even kidding you, chat, since like Street Fighter Cross Tekken, Street Fighter V's launch. It's been over like half a decade. I just want people to like Capcom fighting games again. Modern Capcom fighting games. Classic Capcom fighting games are different, right? You talk back about the older games, like going back before Ultimate Marvel 3 and whatnot. You get a lot of like wonderful reverence and community like wonderful history and legacy and all these things that like, oh man, that feels so good. That time was so awesome. Like that kind of stuff, right? Everything before Street Fighter V was like a little bit like that. Street Fighter Cross Tekken, and maybe not as much. As a Capcom fighting game fan, I just want to be reintroduced to that situation again, right? I want to like have fighting games that are, as games themselves, captivating, engaging, and good enough to be compared to the other giant fighting games that exist now and actually make people happy. So the game is good, and then the community events that grow around it, because guess what? A game is good, then the esports thing just naturally sort of happens. Fighting game communities just naturally grow around a game being what people want, right? You're going to get competitive Souls games, for Christ's sake. It doesn't matter. That is the nature of fighting game communities at one point, or at any given point before they turn into an esports. They start from like a grassroots element and then they grow up. So I get it. They're trying to set these guidelines in place, but I don't feel, based on the past 10 years of fighting game Capcom history, that it's necessary, if not feels anything but like a pushback to those communities in some way. I really don't like it. Until Capcom fighting games, until the games themselves are able to be put upon such like a high pedigree, right? Until they're able to be put on this insane pedigree that it seems like they're setting up for, like the Valorant / League / StarCraft or Dota or whatever the hell people are playing now, or whatever the fucking Fortnite shit kids are playing, I don't know. Until it's up there with those and reaching big numbers like those, this crazy micromanagement stuff doesn't make any sense to me. And all it does is create, once again, more stigma. Here's my response.